The Japanese turned success into failure during the Burma campaign of 1944. Specifically examining the battle for Impol and Kohima, as this represents the decisive turning point in the Burma campaign for the Allies. Firstly, it is essential to consider the Japanese principal objectives in the East and their perception of the West, the Japanese occupation of Burma and the formation of the Burma National Army, BNA, the contrasting leadership of Renya Mutaguchi versus William Slim. Finally, assessing how the terrain proved a critical factor during the Japanese withdrawal, all with the purpose of evaluating how the Japanese converted early success into catastrophic failure. Examining the foundations of the Burma campaign, Hastings, 2006, argues it is vital to understand the Japanese people and their wartime ideology. Throughout 1944-45, Japanese leadership fought and governed through the Yamato spirit, the dangerous conviction that immense human sacrifice could offset a severe deficiency in military capability. This was most vividly demonstrated during the Battle for Saipan in 1944, when American forces assaulted the island with the strategic purpose of securing it for future offensive air operations. It was only during this engagement that the American forces truly witnessed the consequences of decades of Japanese ideological indoctrination. American troops faced a threat not only from Japanese military personnel but also from Japanese civilians, who routinely chose to fight with bamboo spears rather than surrender to those they had been conditioned to regard as enemies of the Japanese Empire. After American forces secured the island, Emperor Hirohito learned that civilians were capitulating to Allied forces. Fearing the erosion of Japan's national spirit and concerned that the Americans would exploit this as a propaganda victory, on July 8, 1944, Emperor Hirohito broadcast a radio message encouraging the civilians of Saipan to take their own lives. Over 1,000 civilians complied, starkly illustrating both the devastating reach of state-driven indoctrination and the crippling consequences of leadership rooted in fear of failure. In December 1941, Japan committed itself to asymmetric warfare against adversaries overwhelmingly superior in both resources and industrial capacity. Japanese leadership operated under two fundamental assumptions. Firstly, that the United States would lack the political endurance for a prolonged conflict in the Pacific. Secondly, that Germany would emerge victorious in Europe. December 1941 marked Japan's campaign to expand its territorial reach throughout Asia, driven by the dual imperatives of securing additional resources and creating living space for the Japanese population. This expansionist ambition had been a consistent feature of Japanese policy since the turn of the century and continued to enjoy broad popular support domestically. However, following the Japanese intervention in French Indochina in 1941, the Japanese population grew increasingly resentful and humiliated by America's condemnation of Japanese imperial ambitions. Thorne, 1985, notes that the American stance on Japanese imperialism bred a deep cultural contempt for the West, encapsulated in the belief that money-making is the one aim in life of Americans. This sentiment, reinforced by Japanese army propaganda, which depicted a Japanese soldier charging triumphantly over British and American flags beneath the slogan "Fire and Never Quit," cultivated a fierce anti-Western sentiment within the Japanese military and civilian population alike. Navarro, 2017, further establishes that this process of dehumanization was not exclusive to the Japanese, as Allied propaganda similarly portrayed Japanese soldiers as subhuman and animalistic. These attitudes were most brutally reflected in Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners of war. The Tokyo Tribunal revealed that Western POW camps under Japanese administration recorded a death rate of 27.1%, a figure 7 times higher than that of equivalent camps in Germany or Italy. Combined with atrocities including the Laha massacre, the Banka Island Massacre, and the Bataan Death March throughout the Pacific Campaign, these events cemented a Western perception of Japan as a nation of war criminals, forces war records. 2017. This context produced the conditions for a conflict driven by vengeance, enabling Americans to view the Japanese as fundamentally inferior and without humanity, as reflected in Admiral William Halsey's, commander of the South Pacific Forces, widely cited declaration early in the war. Kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs. Dower, 1993, observed that while Western racism drew condemnation from those it targeted, Japan focused its efforts inward, cultivating a narrative that Japanese expansion represented the liberation of subjugated Asian peoples from the dominance of white imperialism. Presenting itself as the architect of an Asian brotherhood, Japan sought to position itself as the instrument by which Western interference in Asia would be permanently dismantled. However, Dower, 1993, identifies that this narrative concealed a far more sinister agenda, as Japan harbored ambitions not of shared fraternity but of racial replacement, intending to supplant Western dominance with Japanese supremacy across the continent. This reveals that while the Allies engaged in racial stereotyping, Japan was constructing a carefully managed illusion of liberation to mask exploitative imperial intentions. Nevertheless, the manner in which Japan treated both prisoners of war and the populations of nominally liberated nations, including Thailand and Burma, eroded this facade and cost Japan the genuine support it required, ultimately allowing the West to cultivate allegiances with local forces such as the Burma Defense Force. On December 14, 1941, under the command of Mutaguchi, Japanese forces advanced into Burma with the strategic objective of pushing westward to extend Japanese territorial control and sever the Allied supply lines sustaining China, thereby undermining China's capacity to continue its war against Japan. Hickey, 2011, notes that capturing the Burma Road would deny military supplies to China, making Chinese resistance increasingly untenable and paving the way for Japanese conquest. Furthermore, the capture of Burma would provide Japan with an advantageous staging point from which to threaten India, where Japanese strategists believed the presence of their forces would ignite an internal uprising against British colonial rule. Hastings, 2006, observes that Burmese resentment of British colonialism provided the ideal preconditions for Japanese claims of liberation. Initially, the Burmese population welcomed their new Asian liberators until Japan began systematically extracting Burma's natural resources and conscripting its population into its own military framework. Japan facilitated the creation of the Burma National Army, BNA, drawing recruits primarily from communities most hostile to British rule. However, serious tensions emerged almost immediately. The BNA received virtually no recognition for its contributions and was consistently treated as subordinate to even the lowest-ranking Japanese privates, with senior BNA officers required to salute Japanese enlisted men. These indignities led the BNA to defect at the earliest viable opportunity. This transition provided Field Marshal William Slim with a significant operational advantage during the advance on Rangoon, as BNA forces offered negligible resistance. This outcome further illustrates how Japan squandered initial goodwill in Burma by abandoning promises of independence in favor of exploitation, transforming it from an ally into a liability. Examining Mutaguchi's early successes in the Burma campaign, his defining qualities were his relentless aggression and willingness to advance through terrain that most commanders would have considered prohibitive. As a commander, however, he possessed an unrealistic drive for success, prone to overambitious objectives with insufficient grounding in operational reality. This was demonstrated most clearly in May 1942, when his forces caught the British completely unprepared, driving them back across the Chindwin River and out of Burma entirely. Yet fundamental failures were evident within the broader Japanese command structure, characterized by rigidity and an inability to adapt, regardless of whether operations were succeeding or failing. This is most clearly illustrated during the Yugo offensive, when General Sato had no operational necessity to assault Kohima directly, and should instead have bypassed it to strike the railway junction at Dimapur, thereby cutting Allied supply lines at their most vulnerable point. Borton, 2002. When Sato recognized that his forces were being driven off Kohima Ridge and signaled his intention to withdraw, Mutaguchi's response was characteristically inflexible. "Retreat and I will court-martial you." Sato's reply was equally unambiguous. "Do what you please. I will bring you down with me." Burton, 2002, concludes that as the campaign progressed, the breakdown of cohesion and the clash of personal ambitions within the senior Japanese command structure became increasingly decisive in producing operational failure. Hastings, 2006, further identifies that Mutaguchi demonstrated consistent contempt for the assessments of his intelligence officers and senior staff, dismissing warnings about logistical vulnerabilities, the approaching monsoon, and the absence of meaningful air support. Mutaguchi rationalized this by gambling on capturing sufficient British supplies to sustain his advance, effectively rendering Allied logistics his own. This audacity initially caught the Allies off balance and allowed Japanese forces to push to the outskirts of both Impol and Kohima. However, as the monsoon season arrived, Mutaguchi's already fragile logistics chain disintegrated entirely. Having conceded air superiority to the British, aerial resupply was impossible, and with it any realistic prospect of sustaining his forces. Historically, Japanese soldiers advanced light, carrying approximately 15 days' worth of rations and supplementing provisions by living off the land. But against a determined and well-supplied opponent fighting from prepared defensive positions, this approach proved wholly inadequate and ultimately contributed to the annihilation of his forces. Contrasting the leadership philosophies of Mutaguchi and Slim, 2009, it becomes readily apparent that Slim demonstrated far greater compassion toward his subordinates and possessed considerably broader operational experience. Having witnessed the demoralizing defeat at Arakan, Slim understood that improving the physical conditions and welfare of his troops was a prerequisite for improving their effectiveness in battle. Drawing on his own accounts of the Burma campaign, Slim placed considerable emphasis on his commanders' responsibility for the health and morale of their men. On one occasion, Slim inspected a company and discovered that 95% of soldiers had failed to take their anti-malaria medication. He relieved the company commander immediately and reinforced the critical importance of medical discipline throughout the force. As a result, malaria casualties declined significantly, freeing up manpower for training and allowing units to invest time in developing jungle warfare skills. Mutaguchi, by contrast, along with the broader Japanese command, treated the sick and wounded with indifference bordering on contempt. Casualties were abandoned in the field, left with grenades and expected to make what Japanese doctrine framed as the ultimate sacrifice. Once again, the Yamato spirit was invoked to substitute for sound medical and welfare provisions. This reveals a fundamental failure on Mutaguchi's part to develop any workable contingency for managing operational setbacks, a gap that the Allies would repeatedly and effectively exploit. As the 15th, 31st, and 33rd Divisions advanced through Burma, it became apparent that Mutaguchi's plan to take Impol was critically time-dependent. He had allocated 3 months to capture both Impol and Kohima, a deadline imposed not merely by operational ambition but by the onset of the monsoon season, which would dramatically slow movement on both sides while rendering resupply and casualty evacuation extremely difficult. This imperative for speed was one of the primary reasons Mutaguchi chose to press through severely demanding terrain at pace, gambling that a rapid seizure of Impol would allow his forces to secure British supplies and consolidate a position from which to threaten India when conditions improved after the monsoon. The inherent risk in this approach, flagged clearly by his own staff, was that failure to achieve objectives within the 3-month window would leave his forces cut off from reinforcement and resupply entirely. This vulnerability was identified and exploited by the Allies. Advancing through dense jungle inherently restricted Japanese movement, and Allied air superiority, firmly established by this stage of the campaign, ensured that Japanese attempts to compensate through aerial resupply were consistently denied. Borton, 2002. Having studied Mutaguchi's tactical preferences throughout the campaign, Slim, 2006, recognized that the Japanese consistently favored encirclement, isolating Allied positions by cutting them off and destroying them through flanking maneuvers and deep infiltration. Allen, 1984, notes that Slim had absorbed these lessons directly from his experience in May 1942, when his army was driven 900 miles out of Burma. Rather than advancing to meet Japanese forces at the Chindwin River, Slim resolved to exploit Japanese logistical fragility and fight a deliberate defensive battle on the Impol plains on ground in terms of his own choosing. He also countered the Japanese strategy of severing the road between Impol and Kohima by exploiting Allied air superiority to maintain continuous aerial resupply of rations, reinforcements, mail, and medical provisions to encircled positions within the defensive battle. Slim made effective use of artillery and armor to support infantry in static positions, transforming the engagement into a battle of attrition that consistently favored the better supplied Allied force. Mutaguchi's men, lacking adequate food, ammunition, and medical support, suffered catastrophic casualties. As the weeks passed, and the operation they had expected to conclude in triumph became a slow and irreversible disintegration. Slim, 2006, does acknowledge, however, that he underestimated the scale of Japanese commitment to Kohima. He had anticipated that Mutaguchi would commit a regiment to that sector, but instead received the full weight of 31st Division. Despite this miscalculation, Burton, 2002, highlights that Slim's investment in developing the 14th Army over the preceding months paid considerable dividends. Slim was a committed advocate of mission command, emphasizing flexibility at every level of command and encouraging tactical initiative throughout the force. This culture of adaptability proved decisive in contrast to the rigid, formulaic approach consistently demonstrated by Japanese commanders when their attacks failed to achieve the anticipated effect. The Japanese primary operational objective was to establish roadblocks between Impol and Kohima, denying Slim the ability to mutually reinforce those positions. This succeeded initially in isolating elements of the 50th Parachute Regiment on Kohima Ridge, leaving them encircled, heavily outnumbered, and urgently in need of relief. Allied air superiority enabled the 161st Indian Infantry Brigade to break the encirclement, though the relief force remained numerically inferior. It was not until the arrival of the fresh 2nd British Infantry Division at Kohima that Japanese forces were finally driven from the ridge. This development triggered the withdrawal of 31st Division, releasing sufficient Allied resources to mount a decisive counteroffensive at both Impol and Kohima. Mutaguchi's forces, by this stage broken in spirit, severely malnourished, and critically short of all supplies, began their retreat through the same merciless terrain they had crossed with such confidence months earlier. Flooded rivers, trackless jungle, and the full fury of the monsoon season combined to transform the withdrawal into a death march. It was during the retreat to the Chindwin River that Japanese losses reached their most devastating levels. Slim's forces needed little more than to follow the trail of bodies and abandoned equipment to locate and engage Japanese main forces. The terrain and climate exacted a toll during The withdrawal that exceeded even the casualties inflicted in direct combat. The battles for Imphal and Kohima represented Japan's first decisive strategic defeat in the Burma theater and provided the platform from which Slim's 14th Army developed its own comprehensive jungle warfare doctrine. The Burma operation validated two critical military concepts: the viability of large-scale aerial resupply and sustaining forces in isolated defensive positions, and the definitive dismantling of the perception that Japanese soldiers were militarily invincible. Japan had taken early success and, through a combination of command dysfunction, doctrinal inflexibility, logistical incompetence, strategic overreach, and the loss of air superiority, engineered its own destruction. These compounding failures, exacerbated by the unforgiving constraints of terrain and monsoon weather, collectively produced the first major Allied victory in the Eastern Theater and fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Burma campaign.